Hey, it's Jessica Goose here with RealAgriculture.com, and joining me right now is Jacob Shapiro, who's an independent geopolitical risk analyst, and he's one of the keynote speakers here at GrainWorld in Saskatoon. Jacob, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I just did my speech, so now I can relax a little bit and put my feet up and talk with you.
Exactly. And your speech, I think it was great because it's not only relatable, there's also some serious topics that people, I think, really need to take into account, and that's what we're going to dive into here. So the topic of your speech was the 5 biggest geopolitical forces that will shape the world by 2040. So 2040 is pretty near here. However, these ones are quite big and quite substantial. So the first one that you talked about was in regards to strategic competition for resources. Why is that a key factor?
Well, that'll be the most difficult one to translate it to in an audio argument, but I'll do my best. So if you're listening along, kind of imagine that you've got a series of five different slides. And the first is going to show you where desertification is accelerating in the world. The second is going to show you where we're going to have more cities, more urbanization in the world. Mm-hmm. The third is going to show you where population is increasing. And then the fourth, where climate change is most going to affect agriculture. And the real punchline of the whole thing is that it's all in the same places. It's all Africa, it's all the Middle East, and it's all Asia. And so the argument is basically twofold. It's that you're going to have a lot more demand for especially food and water and competition over arable land in these parts of the world, but also that we're seeing a rising class of revisionist powers. And the 3 ones that I identify are China, Russia, and Turkey. You might be able to add a few more. But these are countries that are thinking about food and water not from a trade or import-export point of view like we are used to doing. They're increasingly thinking about it in terms of national security, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of zero-sum interests that have to be protected rather than something that they trade for.
And so the biggest stat that I found that took me for a shock was the one about China, and it had to do with water, I believe. And so China has 60% of the world's population, however, only 9% of water. So obviously something is going to have to change there in the near future.
Well, it's actually, so that statistic is for Asia, but if you want to drill right down into China, it's a similar situation. They have roughly 20% or 21% of the world's population, and it's either 9% or 6%. It's either 9% water and 6% land or 6%.
But still quite low compared to where else that's kind of a 50-50.
Well, yeah, well, in North America, you have 5 to 10% of the global population, 50% of the permanent water resources. Yeah. But again, the other thing for China is that the water that they do have is polluted. They industrialized so fast, and the way that you industrialize fast is you don't care about pollution or all these other things. That's why when you listen to the Chinese government, they've literally declared war on environmental issues. That's because it's a real issue for them. A lot of the water that they do have is polluted, and they have to try and fix that going forward.
And so the second topic here is the maturation of China. And so I feel China is kind of a biggie in your top 5 here. But it's because they are doing a lot of work, not necessarily in front of the scenes, but also behind the scenes here. And so what have you been seeing in regards to China with that?
Yeah, there's a couple things that I'll let my hair down a little bit with you, even though I have no hair. I didn't call it the rise of China, and I didn't call it the collapse of China, which those are usually the 2 poles that most geopolitical analysts go through. I don't think they're rising. I think they've already risen, and I don't think they're going to collapse. I would also tell you that personally, it's the hardest one for me to talk about because I think a zero-sum strategic competition between China and the United States, even God forbid a war at some point, would be disastrous for the world, it would be disastrous for China, disastrous for the United States. And I know that when you're in the business of telling people stories and relaying information to people, sometimes you can create narratives that aren't necessarily true. That said, I don't think you can get around the fact that China and the US are locked into a strategic competition now, and I don't see a path for them to get out of it. Maybe if there's a change in the White House, maybe if Donald Trump isn't president anymore, maybe that's a path forward. But honestly, the only thing that the US political establishment seems to be willing to agree on at this point is that China is bad. I've heard government officials talking about the relationship with China like it's a war already, literally using that kind of terminology. And China is less forthright in that language, but if you look at what they're doing, where they're spending money on their military, where they're trying to secure resources abroad, it seems to me like both sides are preparing for this strategic competition going forward.
Number 3 here, you have the rise of India, and I don't think this will come as a shock to many.
I mean, India's problem is that it's never really been able to get out of its own way. Another really interesting thing about India, which I didn't mention in the talk, was that India is basically the mirror image of China. So China is vast and large, but it's authoritarian, it's top-down, it's about the greater good, and there's a real sense of social stability and the government being there to impose harmony if it's not automatically there. India is sprawling, it's a democracy in the true sense of the term. There's corruption everywhere. You sort of get all the pitfalls of democracy and all the benefits of democracy at the same time, and yet they also are the only country that is in the same size class as China, right? So the really interesting thing about India, and where everything will hinge on, is whether that government can make some strategic decisions going forward. I look at the Modi government and I see sort of the first emanations of maybe a coherent national Indian strategy that can be used across the country rather than how regionalized and piecemeal it's been in the past. I could be wrong about that, but that's what India depends on. It doesn't need to become authoritarian and top-down and centrally run, but it does need to develop a basic national cohesiveness and a basic national strategy that is the same in all of the different Indian states.
One thing I found interesting that you touched on was that, and it hasn't really made news too much, or at least I haven't seen too much of it, is the fact that India was supposed to sign a trade deal with the U.S. Up here in Canada, trade with India, especially when it comes to pulses, is pretty slim pickings right now due to fumigation laws that are kind of tricky, or at least that they're making tricky for us. Do you feel like India needs to go that kind of trade route with making these deals with certain countries, or do you feel that's what's going to happen sooner than later?
Long-term, India is not going to have a choice. It's really just a matter of time. If you read, some of the papers and research that's being done, some people think India will be able to grow enough food until 2030, some say 2040. But at a certain point, they're probably the most water-stressed country in the world. At a certain point, they're going to have to move away from protecting Indian farmers to importing enough food so that everybody can eat. I think long-term, India is not really going to have a choice. I think what India is going to try to do as much as possible is not to link those economic deals with strategic imperatives. They don't want to get locked into a geopolitical position just because they have to import something from the United States. And that's what's different between India in 1800 and India today. In 1800, when the Indians met the British Empire, the British got to do whatever they wanted and basically used India as a steroid shot to continue their empire for an extra 100 years that they probably don't have without India. The United States and the Western world is kind of looking at India through the same lens, and India is too powerful for that. If you're going to do business in India, it's a long game. You have to establish connections, and you really have to create deals that are mutually beneficial, because they will resist if you try and do this kind of zero-sum, do what we want or else.
And now, kind of in that same neck of the woods, number 4 here is the Muslim civil war. And one thing you noted here is to keep your eye on Turkey. Why is that?
Well, in the same sense that I sort of see China geopolitically being driven to be more defensive and more aggressive, I see the same thing happening out of Turkey. I see Turkey getting much stronger militarily. I see it laying the ideological groundwork for a more expansionist foreign policy. I see them playing a bunch of different powers against each other, and I see them really strengthening their military. We talk a lot about what's going on in northern Syria. People don't also appreciate that when there was that attempted coup against Erdogan, he cleared out the officer class. They're all loyal to him now. They're building a new military base in Qatar. They've got military bases in the Horn of Africa. A lot of these countries in the Middle East that are looking around, they all talk about Iran, and so Turkey is the one that is really asserting itself, and I think it's the one that has the most robust power source. Unlike Saudi Arabia, it's not dependent on one commodity. Unlike Iran, it hasn't been isolated from the global economy for a decade. It's a real functioning economy, and there's a strong national identity. So I think going forward, Turkey looks like a major power.
And it's not necessarily all negative over there. One thing, and actually you just recently visited there, was Uzbekistan, and you said that that might be a good opportunity for trade.
I'm really bullish on most of Central Asia in general, and I might be too optimistic about it because in one sense they're on the front line of geostrategic competition. They're right there between Russia and China and the Muslim world. The United States is running around there too. But at the same time, I think that's ultimately good for Central Asia. And aside from Turkmenistan with their crazy leader that we can talk about if you want, a lot of these countries are opening up.
Yeah.
And they're understanding that the way that they're going to be able to move forward is by connecting people, by serving as bridges between Europe and between Asia, by allowing trade to come through. I think it's also partly by necessity. Climate change is really beginning to affect Central Asia, especially water resources there. They get most of their waters from glacier runoff, and those glaciers are melting. Probably won't be here in 30 or 40 years if we're being honest. So they're having to import a lot of different things and probably more going forward. The problem with Central Asia is getting there, right? Because the Russians think it's in their sphere of influence. The Chinese want it to be in their sphere of influence, and they're trying to build all the infrastructure. Sometimes there's backlash. But getting to Central Asia is a problem, I can tell you from personal experience. But once you're there, these are countries that are trying to throw off the negative impacts of being in the Soviet Union for so long, and they're open for business.
That's good. That's good for sure. Lastly here, number 5 is America's Victorian era. And a lot of people are spending money, especially when it comes to, you pointed to the financial crisis in '08, and people haven't really, dug themselves out of that hole. But the biggest slide that I, again, was blown away by was the GDP number for where America is now to where they were in the past. Explain to me this.
The debt to GDP number, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. That one, that's funny, that was a throwaway one for me. I like the wealth inequality one more, but that one's also very good, and I kind of ran out of time. It's a 50-minute talk that I squeezed into 40 minutes, but usually I have a slide right before it that shows you the British Empire's debt to GDP and the areas when it sparked, and it goes back to that Victorian era analogy. But yeah, the United States debt to GDP ratio is basically approaching where it was at the height of World War II. And as I said in the talk, in World War II, the United States was literally invading 2 separate continents and also developing the atomic bomb, doing a whole bunch of other things. The United States is not doing anything so ambitious now. I guess the F-35 program is just going to suck how many billions of dollars into it. But when you look at what the United States is doing, it's really borrowing to maintain a lifestyle that can't really afford for itself right now. And the United States is the richest country in the world. The dollar is still the global reserve currency. I think it will be for decades. But there's a real question about how high does that figure have to get before people start wondering, is this really that stable? Now, the U.S. is so wealthy, I don't know whether that's 400% of GDP or 600% of GDP. I think the dollar is strong and there's a lot of room for that to grow. But just that comparison with the British Empire, where right before Britain was going into World War I, that spike of debt, that's why it's disturbing to me from the U.S. perspective. It seems to just be repeating past mistakes that it literally should know better than to do.
We should learn, especially from history. Now, to wrap up here, one thing that you left the audience was, buckle up your seatbelts. It's going to get a little rough in the future. And what did you kind of mean by that?
I really meant that from the point of view of U.S. domestic politics. I think an outsized level of attention is paid to President Donald Trump, and I get it. He's crazy, and he's a walking quote machine, and he expresses things in ways that are incredibly controversial and rule-breaking. At the same time, though, Donald Trump is a symptom. He's not a cause of anything. So what's happening in the United States is you're getting all this debt, and you're getting all this wealth inequality, and you're getting the accumulation of bad foreign policy decisions, and you're getting a United States that is turning inward, that really isn't happy with the U.S.'s role in the world, doesn't really know what the U.S.'s role in the world is, and is just looking for someone to talk to them, to give them a vision of the world that they can hang their hat on. And for whatever reason, and I can't explain it, Donald Trump is the person that was able to convince Americans of that. Again, though, I don't think it really matters who it's going to be. Whoever gets into the White House either in 2020 or 2024, they're going to get there by answering to U.S. domestic interests. This is not a United States where foreign policy is the primary concern. It's all domestic politics. Now, you're going to have foreign policy kind of masquerading a strategy. Really, the foreign policy is just an expression of what does the American electorate want? What do American voters want? And these leaders are going to be thinking about satisfying constituencies and not about long-term geopolitical strategy.
Goals. Yeah, especially, and I think that goes to Donald Trump's campaign of, make America great again and buying local, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but you can't put all your eggs in one basket. You have to look, like you said, long-term goals. You have to look at trade and where other countries stand to help you, to help them.
Yeah, and I didn't quite get to this in the talk, but kind of
please share.
one other parting shot would be that geopolitics itself is a way of looking at the world, of trying to understand how nation states relate to each other. And I find that there's a tendency when speaking about these things to kind of say, okay, well, this is what it looks like, so this is how it's going to be forever. And really, my talk today was designed to be a snapshot of a moment in time. It's not meant to be a precise forecast. I doubt that I'm going to be right about everything that I said. I would rather be interesting, thought-provoking, making people ask questions that they didn't already know. So don't take these predictions out to, I mean, certainly I would like to be right about all of them. I know I'll be wrong about some of them. And if there's one thing I can leave people with, it's have that flexibility. Have a good sense of what's going on in the world now. Be clear-eyed and pragmatic about it, but also be prepared for it to change. We could get to 2028 and the United States could come out of its little self-absorption bubble and be in a completely different world. So don't let what I think is a pretty accurate snapshot of today necessarily mean that, 2030 India is going to be there. I think so. That's the way it looks. But if things change, you have to be able to adapt quickly.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.